You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today and want to welcome Charles Hoskinson with the Washington Examiner. And Charles, thank you so much on such short notice for joining us today. And I do appreciate the fact that you've got such a depth of knowledge to be able to handle a couple, almost completely different issues that we would like to cover, that being immigration and the other, what's going on in Israel. So, again, Charles, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
First, if we can, I'd like to get the easy one. I don't know if it's necessarily easy, but I suppose it is. The easy one would be the immigration story out of the way first. And when you look at what's going on in this nation, and as you try to analyze the immigration issue, I think most of the issue is the fact that as a nation, not only this president, but other presidents, we're simply not following the immigration law that we have in place right now. And it also seems that this country is not necessarily willing to sit down and address the changes to the laws that may or may not need to be made. What are your thoughts on those two?
Well, it's become a very contentious issue, and obviously politics plays a role in that. I mean, there are a couple of strains in it. One of the big problems is that this administration, to the average observer, seems like the immigration laws are too hard to enforce, so we're not going to try it. But obviously, there's more politics behind it than that, and they like to paint their opposition as being anti-immigrant. So it's being, and the media goes along with this stark black and white, this presentation of the issue in kind of black and white terms, but it's not like that at all. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. Finish your thought, please.
I was just going to say that Obama likes to say the immigration system. President Obama likes to say the immigration system is broken, but is it really broken? I mean, if you talk about the process by which people come to the United States because they want to become Americans, that's working just fine. What's not working right now is the border security.
Yeah, I think the border security is a major issue, and obviously because not only are we watching drugs come into this country, we're watching the human trafficking and other issues, but we just see random people from numerous countries crossing our borders. So you have to beg the question when you look at this from a national security standpoint, and I do believe that it's an issue of national security. What else is coming into our nation? Do we have terrorist cells coming into this nation? Do we have operatives from intelligence agencies from other nations who mean to do us harm or simply want to gain information from us coming across our borders? We really have no idea. And I think if we did, then we would probably hear more about it. And I don't think we do. I think it's probably the best kept secret if it is.
Well, we don't have any idea. I mean, the more immediate concern is, are there gang members and drug dealers coming into this country, and drugs as well? And the answer to that is almost certainly yes. But fundamentally, the government does not know exactly how many people are here illegally, doesn't know where they are, it doesn't know what they're doing, it doesn't know who's coming, it doesn't know how long they're staying. It estimates these things, but it guesses at these things, but it does not know. And getting a handle on that should be the beginning of any kind of sound immigration policy.
Right. We also guess at what our deficit's going to be each year, and we throw out numbers anywhere from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, and on a good year maybe, I guess, $500 billion. But I think it's the same thing. We really have no idea until you're able to correctly calculate the number, and unfortunately, it's something that you find out after the fact. And I think this is, it's interesting because when you see the things that are happening in these other nations, you could understand why, the children or people would want to leave there, and you could certainly understand why you'd want to come to America, because I don't think either you or myself or John are ready to go leave America because we're very happy here. And it's certainly the land of opportunity. But again, we are a nation, we're a sovereign nation, we have our own borders and culture and language, and we also have our own issues and things that we have to deal with. And we have significant issues here. We have a significant problem trying to pay for our issues as well. And I'd offer that we simply can't afford to handle the rest of the world's problems. And I think that's what we end up doing in these particular cases.
Well, I mean, it seems, I mean, there are 15 million people in Guatemala. Okay, they can't all come here, as you said. We couldn't accommodate them all. And even if we could, what would that do to Guatemala? It would, you'd have an empty country where only the rich people would get. It would be like a theme park for all the very rich people who live there. That's about it.
Well, maybe you and I would go there if they all left.
Yeah, it's not in anyone's interest for that to happen.
Right. Agreed.
What's happening here, though? We have to understand the underlying political, the underlying political issue that drives it. Well, the Democrats see these people and they see red states turning blue or turning purple, like Virginia and Colorado, because of increased Hispanic immigration. They see these people coming across the border as potential Democratic voters. They have no interest in making Americans out of them. They would love to see them stay isolated culturally, linguistically, economically, so that they could, as long as they get their citizenship. This is what the Democrats have drawn a line on. They will not support any immigration measure. Obama will not support an immigration measure that does not include a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants. They have consistently refused to accept guest worker programs that would legalize the people who are here, who have jobs, as workers, because they essentially want to use them politically. And this is not in the interest of the United States as a nation. It's not in the interest of the American people. And it's not in the interest of the nations from which these people come, because it's the message that they're getting down there is, come to America, you'll get to stay, everything will be provided for you.
We're speaking with Charles Hoskinson, opinion editor at the Washington Examiner. Charles, this is John Rappaport. Sometimes the first guests don't always recognize our voices are very close together, obviously, as brothers. Hi. So this is very interesting. I'm glad you brought the point up the way you did, because immigration, to a large extent, much like gun control, can be looked at as a huge failing of the Democratic Party. And I think you're spot on in that this is really nothing more than a ploy to buy votes. And I have an enormous problem with that, because, as you said, not only is it not necessarily fair to those people, but the Republicans, if they were smart, would actually point out that the Democrats are the party of what I would refer to as indentured servitude, because you look at literally 50-plus years now of entire cities that have been inundated with the Democratic policies that have been complete, contained biospheres or organisms, if you will, of Democratic principles, like Chicago, like Detroit, for example, that have failed miserably. And whether you're looking at Chicago from a gun control policy, you look at last weekend, it was more dangerous to be in Chicago than it was to be in Ukraine. Not just in Ukraine, but in the area of Ukraine being bombed.
That's true. Or Iraq.
Or Iraq, exactly. So what challenges me here is I can understand, because of they've made it clear that the Democrats seem to be far less concerned about America's future, its financial future, its health, its sovereignty, etc., and they're all about buying a permanent voting bloc. But the Republicans continue to keep falling into their game, and it seems to me that the only way for them to really win this is to change the conversation entirely and start focusing on not just the security of this, but really focus on the economics. Because I agree that security is maybe one of the biggest problems, but the economics of this is completely unfair to the quote-unquote middle-class Americans, because all of those people, there is limited resources. It's like the Democrats at the border are bringing in a vacation home, and America can't even pay for its own house. You don't buy a vacation home until your own house is in order. And if you look at this from an economics perspective, I think it'd be a lot easier to get many, many people, whether they're whatever their race, creed, is, etc., to look at this and see that you have to take care of your own first. And this is first and foremost an issue of fairness and rule of law. It has nothing to do with what people, the Republicans, like or do not like.
Well, the Republican Party's messaging on this issue has been horrible. They have allowed the Democrats to back them into a corner. Part of the problem is that there are some people in the Republican Party who really are anti-immigrant, and the Republican Party should not allow itself to be presented that way. I mean, to say that you want tighter border security, as I just did, does not mean that that you want that to keep people out. You want border security because you want to know who's coming. It's a door, not a wall, basically. Another thing the Republicans have made the mistake of doing is allowing the Democrats to turn immigration into a Hispanic issue. It makes it much easier to tar Republicans as racist if immigration is seen as a Hispanic issue. It allows the Democrats to engage American-born Hispanics on their side by claiming that the Republicans hate them all, and this is another thing that the Republicans have allowed both the Democrats and the media to tar them with. I mean, you know, if there were 11 million illegal immigrants in this country from Nigeria, groups like La Raza, they wouldn't care. They wouldn't care one bit about them. But you have a group like La Raza. You have these groups that are known as immigrant rights groups that are really groups that want to create an advantage. They want to create it. They want a rigged immigration system, an open door for their people and a closed door for everybody else. And one of the interesting things about this, if you look at the demographics of people who are here, the people who are here illegally, is that they tend mostly to be unskilled, lower educated, lower skilled workers. These are the people who, they're not taking jobs away from you and I. They're taking jobs away from the kind of people who would vote Democratic, the American-born, lower-skilled American-born workers. You know, the people who come here from other countries, the tech people, the educated people, the doctors. You know, the visas for those individuals are very tightly controlled. You do not have a wave of foreign doctors, of foreign nurses, of foreign teachers, of foreign software engineers coming to America and taking jobs away from Americans, because the visas are extremely tightly controlled. As a matter of fact, they're so controlled, the Silicon Valley complains that there aren't enough of them for the people that they need to fill the jobs they have. No, the people who are coming here are taking jobs away from the Americans who don't have a high school education, who don't have the kind of skills they need to get anything bigger than a minimum wage job. That's who's losing out.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, by the way, and I agree with you. I think that when you just look at the war on poverty, if you will, for so many decades, we've spent, the numbers appear to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 trillion, yet we seem to be no better off. In fact, probably maybe even worse today than we were when we started that war on poverty. And I think it's because they're always looking for new membership for their particular ideology, and they never actually resolve the issues. And I think you're absolutely right. We're willing to let other forms of minority into this nation and the ones that fit what they're looking for, yet the people who are already here, regardless of where they're from, they have their issues too, and that's my argument. We have people in our own country who need better jobs, who may need better housing, who need better opportunities, and it may be all their fault on their own, but before we go addressing the issues of people who aren't even United States citizens, we should at the very least do the best we can to help at least encourage our own citizens to be more successful or further their own prosperity. And I think, this is a case when I hear the argument that, well, it's a tragedy and these are refugees and somebody has to take them in. Well, last time I checked, the United States wasn't the only nation in North America, South America, and Central America. There are other places that these people could have gone, and there are other places that they could still be sent to where they could be a lot safer, if that's the problem, than they would in the countries that they came from. And that's not even being raised.
Well, these nations wouldn't take them. That's just a fact. I mean, the problems in Central America that cause people to emigrate to the United States have been going on for years.
Yes.
And the only difference between that time and the current surge of immigrants is, as far as I can tell, is the perception that if you get here, you can stay here. And that's the perception that has been pushed by the Obama administration for months now, if not years. But to get back to what you said about, I think the Republicans need to seriously take this issue by the hands, take it away from the Chamber of Commerce types who essentially they're just looking for cheap labor. They are supporting what the administration wants because a surge of lower skilled workers drives the cost of unskilled labor down. It helps them. And the best thing the Republicans can do really is to take this issue and say, we want to be the party of the open door. We want to be the party of border security and the open door and opportunity, where you separate out the question of the people who are coming here because they want work and the people who are coming here because they want to be Americans. You say, okay, what I would suggest to the Republicans is basically get around the Democrats and say, our immigration plan is if you can come here and you can get a job, you can stay and work. But if you want to be a citizen, we're not going to lower the standard. So
sounds reasonable.
We're not going to put quotas on immigration. We're not going to put visa quotas. The only thing we ask is that if you want to come here and work from a country nearby, like Mexico or El Salvador, you come to the border, you show your identity card, you show a letter from your employer, and you go to work. And that way, we know who you are, we know you're here, we know why you're here, and we can track you. And you can work, you can get your job, you can send your money back to your family, because that's what most of them want to do. And if you stay here long enough that you want to be a citizen, you apply for citizenship the same way anybody who comes from some other country would do. And you go through the same process where you have to learn English, you have to understand civics, you have to basically assimilate. This is not from 1890 to 1920, there was a huge wave of immigrants into the United States, and this is what they did with them, basically. And there's no reason why we can't do the same thing.
Yes. Charles, I think you're very right. Now, there's a couple of things here. First, you alluded early on in this conversation to the fact that this is actually unfair because we're draining the economic future of some of these countries who are actually sending their bodies here. So as much as we may want to protest them, we may want to stop funding and do other things, there is also a challenge here. Our neighbors to our south, if we make it so easy for everybody, remember, this is not a situation like Syria. There's nothing going on in South America right now as there was during the Reagan era where you had wholesale people being slaughtered and butchered. This is simply economic issues. And of course there are places that have some governments transitioning to socialist tendencies, which is unfair, et cetera. But people are not being wholesale slaughtered, and so it actually works against our better interest to allow these people in here as well, because we want these countries to stabilize. And if people, the same energy that these people are bringing to coming to the U.S. for freebies and for the right to an opportunity and prosperity, if that energy is not turned inward toward their own societies to change their own societies, they will never improve. I mean, look at a country like Mexico. It is so unbelievably corrupt. It's virtually, I would never want to invest any business dollars there. So I want to get your quick opinion on that, and then I want to transition this briefly to discussing Israel, because we're talking about a border crisis, and if this country wants to have some feeling of what it's like to be a country that has no clearly defined border, we need look no further than Israel. So if you want to briefly comment on the immigration side affecting other countries, and then let's talk about another very key ally to us against especially the biggest problem we have globally, which is the war on terror, and let's transition the border conversation there if we will.
Sure. Well, what I'd say about Mexico and Central America is that these countries, the political structure in these countries is somewhat more oligarchical oligarchical than it is in the United States. I mean, you've got the political, social, and economic elite tend to run things a lot more than they do in the United States. And ironically, they have no. They're perfectly happy to let the U.S. suck up their what they consider to be an excess population of poor people, but this ironically puts the Democrats in the position of supporting basically the 1% in those countries. The Democrats are on the side of the 1% in Mexico and El Salvador and Guatemala because they're very happy to take the excess poor people. This is what passes for a social welfare program in these countries. And the Democrats are totally on board with allowing them to use us as their social welfare safety valve.
Great talking point, Charles, one that gets far too little play. So let's transition to Israel and its perspective on the challenges of border control. And while our neighbors to the south aren't necessarily trying to kill us, maybe slowly with drugs, but I'd love to hear what some of the reporting, particularly reporting going on at the Washington Examiner of the crisis going on in Israel, and in particular with the poor support and response as an ally that we've had from this administration regarding moral relativism and being able to identify who's the terrorist and who's the civilized man in this equation.
Well, the fundamental problem with the Obama administration's policy on Israel is it's not reality-based. I mean, they're pushing a peace process that will never lead to peace. And this is, if you recall, Obama went to the United Nations last year and gave a speech and said that his two main priorities in the Middle East were the peace process, Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and the nuclear deal with Iran. And both of those priorities, ironically, work against peace, Israeli-Palestinian peace. So it's the fundamental problem with our approach to Israel is the Obama administration's policy.
Now, are there things that you would like to see changed in that policy? And put aside Republican Democratic typical issues and look strictly from Obama's approach, which has been a strange combination of hands-off in areas where you could argue his hands should be on, and hands-on in areas that you can argue his hands should not have touched.
Well, I mean, if you want to get the Israelis and the Palestinians to make peace, you have to do what you did in Northern Ireland. You have to isolate the conflict. It was easier to do that in Ireland because it's an island. But it's interesting that George Mitchell was Obama's first Mideast envoy. He was the one who worked the deal in Northern Ireland. One of the biggest problems with getting a peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians is that the Israelis and the Palestinians are the only ones formally at the table, but there are just dozens of others out there kibitzing, having their say and influencing the process, usually in a negative way, and foremost among them is Iran. I mean, Iran has been conducting a proxy war with Israel for years through groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. One of the most important things the United States has to do is it has to isolate the Palestinians from this Iranian influence. That's one thing, and any other negative influence that might prevent the Palestinians from being able to focus on making peace with Israel. I mean, if you look at what's happened recently, you had 3 Israeli boys who were kidnapped and then murdered. And this was bound to set the Israelis off, and it did. And Hamas didn't deny the responsibility for the kidnapping and the killing, but they celebrated it. And so did a lot of other Palestinians. They celebrated the killing. Let's assume, for example, that this was the work of some rogue group of militants. If one rogue group of militants can spark a renewed war just by kidnapping and killing some Israeli teenagers, then there's not much hope for a peace process. And until you get that under control, you can't have a peace process. You have to have a Palestinian entity that can control its own people and can speak for its own people and can say to the Israelis, we want peace, and mean it. This is really, the administration blames the Israelis for the failure of the peace talks, but the real failure of the peace talks is that the Israelis cannot trust the Palestinians to keep their word. So they won't make peace, and as long as they can't trust the Palestinians, they won't make peace.
That's absolutely. Charles, do you have a few more minutes?
Sure.
Oh, okay. I know we're going a little long here. I just wanted to make sure before, in case we're keeping you from something. When I look at some of the statements that have come from various people in our administration, from Hillary Clinton to John Kerry to the president himself, or some of the advisors, or even during some of the press conferences from the various heads, they've made some, I think, dangerous and actually almost insightful comments to almost allow the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or both to take some of the actions that they have over the last few years. And I think it's actually been a hindrance of peace. And I would argue, and I agree with you, I make an argument, but I also agree with what you said, in that as long as Hamas is making the calls in at least Gaza, and as long as you have these extreme elements that are in charge or making the bulk of the decisions, you're not going to be able to achieve peace. And my argument is that Israel has offered up so much more, so many times, and they've given back, they've given up things, they've made the concessions for decades now, and they've even made offers that Palestinian leaders such as Arafat and others have just simply walked away from and left on the table. And so I guess the question to you would be, do you think there's anything at all that would be offered that they would even accept outside of maybe Israel picking up and leaving?
Well, let's look at that. What if Israel does just pick up and leave? What if you woke up tomorrow morning and the Israelis said, okay, we're done with the West Bank. We're going to withdraw unilaterally from the whole West Bank all the way back to the pre-67 borders. What do you think would happen?
I think Syria and Lebanon would immediately move south and push the Palestinian people elsewhere anyway.
Exactly. You'd have the West Bank would become a dysfunctional failed state. It would become violent. I mean, this is the perfect test of the absurdity of the peace process. If you were able to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians back to the table, and the Israelis just simply said yes to everything, then that would not create the kind of stable, peaceful existence that the administration says is its goal. It would create a disaster, because if the Israelis pull out of the West Bank, you're going to have Hamas and Fatah fighting for control. You're going to have, the Iranians aren't going to stop meddling. Other countries aren't going to stop meddling. The Saudis are going to want their piece of the action. The Syrians are going to want their piece of the action. It would be. This is why the Israelis don't do it, because they fear what will happen by doing it, even though it might probably be the smartest thing for them to do right now. It would, because if they did it, it would show the whole world that Israeli intransigence isn't the problem. The problem is Palestinian political dysfunction.
Right. Here's the last question I'll have for you on this one. Let's just suppose, and we know this isn't going to happen, but how many weeks or months do you think it would take for the beautiful country of Israel to look like the rest of the Middle East if they did pick up and leave?
Well, I wasn't thinking that they would pick up and leave Israel. I was only thinking that they'd leave the West Bank.
Yeah, but
if Gaza is any example, I mean, the Palestinians, when the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, they left behind the infrastructure behind because they thought the Palestinians could use it, and they trashed it.
Yeah,
they trashed it immediately.
That's
a good example.
Yeah, I think what's happened over the last bunch of decades is absolutely terrible, and frankly, I think the best thing the United States and even the United Nations or other players could do is to withdraw the funding and make everything conditional on the people actually looking to create vibrant economies and civil society and things of that nature. And until that happens, everyone should just take away their money, and you would force them to have to make better decisions.
Well, one thing I'd say, kind of as a closing comment, is that there are a lot of people in the Middle East who do want to create vibrant economies and civil societies. And I think one of the biggest problems for the United States and the region is that we have not consistently supported those people. In many cases, they have been left to languish by our ignorance. In other cases, we've actually supported others against them, like Hamas, for example. While these people, who could have used our vast political, military, economic support, kind of just fall by the wayside.
That's another excellent point. Well, Charles Hoskinson, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and I know that you put out periodic articles throughout the week. Where can people follow those and the other things that you're working on?
You can find us at WashingtonExaminer.com.
Excellent. Thank you again so much for the time, and really appreciated your thoughts and comments today. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, take care.